Sometimes there are moments in life when the injustice and cruelty of others can drive a person into a corner. We often encounter situations where despair and loneliness lead to unpredictable consequences. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a girl named Radka, whose world suddenly collapsed. This is a dark and creepy tale about how the indifference and malice of others can awaken the dark sides in the soul of even the most innocent child. Tension. This story may not be easy to grasp, but it contains an important lesson that cannot be ignored. In the Czech Republic, in a small town, there lived a girl named Radka. Her father lost his job and could not find a job anywhere. Hard times came for her family, and they had to sell their apartment. They moved to Prague and began renting a place in an old, dilapidated building. Radka was sad to say goodbye to all her friends at school, but she promised that she would try to keep in touch with them. The girl did not like the noise and bustle of the new city in which she had to live. People seemed unfriendly, and there were no children her age in her house with whom she could be friends. As the summer came to an end, Radka began to grieve that her life was not turning out the way she would like. Her parents began to reassure her, saying that everything would be fine when she went to school. But the girl was not so sure on the first day of school. Radka hoped that she would make friends with the new kids, but her classmates turned out to be very unfriendly. When she tried to talk to them, they simply turned away from her and walked away. When she asked to play with them, they did not include her in their games. As the days went by, her classmates began to openly bully the girl. They teased her constantly, making fun of her hairstyle, clothes, and country dialect. They told her that she looked like a rat and began to tease her ratty. The girl tried to tell her parents that she was being bullied at school, but they were too busy making money to be distracted by such trifles. The bullying at school became more and more unbearable, and Radka simply did not know what to do. Some children kicked and teased her, others slapped her and took away her lunches. But even worse were their cruel jokes. They tore up her textbooks and drew on her locker. While at school, she tried to avoid her classmates most of the time. One day, the girl couldn't take it anymore. Her classmates dragged her to the river that flowed near the school and threw her in the water. As Radka sat in the school toilet and tried to dry her clothes, a plan was born in Radka's head. By the end of the day, she decided to take revenge on all the kids who tormented her at school. Returning home that evening, she found a dead rat on the side of the road. She picked it up and brought it home. At home, before her parents returned home, she minced the rat and fried it in a frying pan. It smelled terrible, so Radka added a lot of seasonings and spices to the dish. When this disgusting dish was ready, she put it in a plastic container and shoved it into her school bag. The next day, at school, Radka was waiting for lunch to carry out her insidious plan. When the bell rang, she took her lunch, went into the school cafeteria and sat down at one of the tables. She took out the fried rat meat, placed it on the table in front of her, and began to wait. Soon, two girls came up to her, started teasing her and calling her names. They took her lunch and passed it around the cafeteria. Everyone took a bite. All her classmates laughed at her and called her names. Rat, rat. An hour later, her classmates started throwing up. One by one, the children got up from their seats and ran to the toilet. The teacher could not understand what was happening. Radka also ran to the toilet to see the result of her work. All the stalls in the toilet were occupied, and Radka heard the sounds of vomiting and diarrhea. The air was filled with the sickening smell of diarrhea and vomit. Some girls held their hands to their mouths, waiting for their turn at the stall. Others could not wait any longer and threw up right in the sink. When there were no free sinks left, one of the girls threw up right on the girl who was pooping in the sink. A real crush began in the toilet. Radka smiled with satisfaction. The next morning, her classmates realized what was going on. During class, she saw that her classmates were looking at her with hatred. She knew that it was only a matter of time before they would take revenge on her. During the lunch break, two girls approached Radka. Radka thought that they would start hitting her, but on the contrary, they began to apologize to her. "We are very sorry for the way we treated you," they said. "We would like to be friends with you." The girl said that her classmates were waiting for her in the classroom to apologize to her. Even though Radka was a cautious girl, She had waited so long to be treated well that she threw all caution to the wind and followed them. But when they passed the basement door, the girls grabbed her. One of them held Radka tightly, and the other opened the basement door. Radka tried to resist, but it was useless. She was pushed into the basement. Radka fell down the stairs and landed on the cold concrete floor. She heard the doors slam and the key turn in the lock. The basement was at the back of the school. No matter how loudly Radka screamed, no one would hear her. Lying on the floor of the dirty basement, Radka began to cry bitterly. She began to look for another way out, but the windows were too high for her to reach. She was trapped like a rat in a cage. In complete frustration, she began to kick the walls. She hit one wall and broke through the plaster. Radka began to widen the hole until there was a large enough passage in the wall for her to crawl through. Radka looked inside and saw that there were no water pipes or electrical wires. For some unknown reason, a small gap had been made between the inner wall of the basement and the outer wall of the building. The gap was very narrow, it went to the left and turned to the right, but it was wide enough for her to squeeze through. Radka decided that this was her only way out of the basement and walked along the narrow passage. She walked for a long time. It was pitch dark. She began to fear that she would not get out anywhere, but soon, a narrow ray of light loomed ahead, breaking through a crack and widened it. Looking into the crack, she realized that she was next to the school principal's office. She saw the principal sitting at the table, unaware that he was being watched. The principal was not doing anything, he was just sitting at the table, staring at one point. Then he began to pick his nose with his finger and eat the boogers. Ugh, disgusting, Radka thought, chuckled to herself, and began to move on. She reached another crack and scratched it. Looking inside, she saw the geography teacher and the history teacher passionately kissing, embracing each other. Wow, they're having an affair, Radka thought. Moving on, Radka found that the passage began to lead upward. In some places it became almost vertical, and she spent all her strength to continue on. Eventually, she reached another tiny point of light. She looked through the small hole. It took her a while for her eyes to adjust to the light. When her vision cleared, she realized that she was in a toilet. She saw the English teacher sitting on the toilet. Then there was a loud splash. Disgusting, she thought. She continued on, confident that she would soon find an exit. The passage became narrower and lower. Continuing to squeeze between the walls, Radka had to lower herself to the ground and crawl. Finally, she reached a place where the passage turned slightly, forming a small corner. She tried to squeeze into the narrow space. Her head and shoulders squeezed through without a problem, but her pelvis got stuck. She tried to squeeze through with all her might, but she couldn't. The passage was too small. However, when she tried to go back, she realized that she couldn't move an inch. Her butt was stuck tightly between the concrete blocks. Desperately, she twitched, trying to break free, but it was useless. Her worst fears had come true. "I can't believe it," said Radka. "I'm stuck." She began to panic, and it seemed to her that she couldn't breathe. Is she really stuck here forever? She asked herself. The girl rested for a few minutes, trying to calm down and collect her thoughts. She began to think about her mom and dad, and that she might never see them again. Her eyes filled with tears. "Help! Help!" she screamed over and over again, but no one answered her cries. Suddenly, Radka felt something touch her leg. A strange, musty smell filled the air. She lowered her hand and felt the touch of soft, warm fur. As her fingers closed around a long, fleshy tail, she screamed, "Rats!" Several rats climbed onto Radka at once. They climbed onto Radka, almost onto her head, their sharp paws digging into her skin. Radka panicked and felt something bite her ear. Radka began to frantically throw the rats aside, defending herself from them. One of the rats began gnawing at her toes, and she kicked it with all her might. Screams of horror echoed in the dark passage, but no one heard them. For several hours, she fought off hordes of hungry rodents. Every time she thought the rats had retreated, they attacked again. Her neck was stiff and her whole body ached. It seemed there was no hope of salvation. Tormented by terrible pain, Radka reached out and grabbed one of the rats. In a rage, she strangled the rat with one hand and placed its corpse under her head as a pillow. The other rats hid in their shelters. They seemed to be scared. Radka lay in the narrow hole for 3 days, on the verge between life and death. Sometimes she managed to fall asleep for a few minutes. Whenever the rats came too close, she killed one of them with her bare hands and threw the carcass to its comrades. She had to go to the toilet and to the toilet right there. Lying in a pool of her own urine and excrement, Radka lost all hope of salvation. "I wish I could die soon," the poor girl thought. A terrible smell filled the narrow passage. Radka was very hungry and dying of thirst. She was ready to do anything for one sip of water. One rat came too close to her, and when Radka grabbed it, she brought it to her mouth and sank her teeth into it. She began to drink the rat's blood. But the blood of one rat was not enough. A month later, Radka was still in the narrow passage. She managed to survive by catching rats, feeding on their corpses and drinking their blood. She was terribly bored, and her only entertainment was listening to the squeak of rats. There came a time when she began to think that she understood their language. One day, when Radka woke up, she tried to break free again. She had become so thin that she finally moved from the spot. She crawled further along the corridor until she reached the desired ray of light that burned her eyes. Radka's teacher stood in front of the class, and her classmates were sitting at their desks. Suddenly, they heard something pounding on the back wall of the classroom, plaster crumbling and bricks flying. A pair of fists emerged from a hole in the wall. With their mouths open, Radka's classmates watched as something dirty and smelly came out of the wall. It smelled like 100 toilets. Something crawled across the floor, and everyone realized it was a little girl. Her face was covered in dried blood, and her clothes were smeared with shit and urine. Everyone started screaming in horror. At that moment, a whole horde of rats poured out of the hole. They started attacking the children. "Kill them all!" Radka shouted, jumping on one of the girls and grabbing her hand. Mad with hunger, it sank its teeth into her hand and started drinking her blood. The girl screamed in horror and pain. The teacher ran up to them and tried to save the girl. Radka jumped on him too and started gnawing on his leg. The children screamed and cried, and the rats literally swarmed over them. The rodents scurried back and forth, scratching and biting everyone. No one could escape. The rats' sharp teeth sank into everything they came across. Hands, feet, necks. A real pandemonium began. A few minutes later, when the police arrived, it was all over. They found the walls, floor, and ceiling of the classroom smeared with blood. The remains of children were scattered all over the room. In the center of all this chaos, a little girl sat on the floor, gnawing on the corpse of her teacher. This is how this terrifying story ends about what pain and despair can do when souls are cornered. Radka became a victim of cruelty, but instead of finding solace and support, she chose the path of revenge, which led her to an even darker and more terrible fate. Remember that each of us is responsible for our actions, and even the most innocent-looking cruelty can be the beginning of a chain of devastating events. Thank you for watching, and remember that kindness and attention to others can change the world around us for the better.